What's cracking, everybody? It's Dom from Lensprotogo and Lens Rentals. Welcome back to the channel. So within the past 2 years or so, Canon, Nikon, and Sony have each released their first flagship mirrorless camera bodies, so pretty exciting. And we don't have Nikon Z9 in stock with us today, but what I do have is Sony's A1 and Canon's EOS R3. Now, each of these manufacturers have already impressed us with a mirrorless camera body or two in the past. Canon's R5 and R6 are both powerhouse hybrid cameras, which each take full advantage of these awesome new mirrorless RF Canon lenses. And Sony, on the other hand, who jump-started this whole mirrorless camera craze with their super popular Sony Alpha cameras. And they've even had the time now to branch off those cameras into 3 separate lines, the A7S, A7R, and A7 lines, that could pretty much suit any type of shooter. So with that sort of groundwork laid out, Sony saw it fit to roll out their first flagship mirrorless camera body, the Sony A1. And not terribly long afterwards, Canon followed suit with their release of their first flagship mirrorless, the EOS R3. And at first glance, it's pretty apparent that Sony and Canon went different directions in the creation of their first flagship mirrorless, but these two cameras might be more similar in some ways than you'd think. So that's why I want to take this video to compare these two mirrorless flagships side by side as we go through a couple of major categories for a flagship body. And then at the end, we'll talk about how these two cameras stacked up. Alright, so the first category I just want to sort of get out of the way is video recording. And I say just get it out of the way because I know primarily these bodies are really just geared for professional photography, but there are some really impressive video specs going on here that are definitely flagship worthy. For example, 8K video capture on the Sony A1. Using the full area of that 50 megapixel sensor, the A1 can record 8K UHD, that's 7680 by 4320, up to 30 frames per second. This is in a 10-bit 420 container, but the 4K high-speed recording mode allows for 10-bit 422 4K all the way up to 120 frames per second. So that's huge. Also, if you drop down to 1080, you can record 240 frames per second. The Canon caps out at 120 frames per second in 1080, but that 4K video spec on paper is matched just about exactly on the R3. It can also capture 4K video up to 120 frames per second at a 10-bit 422 sampling rate, but it can do this in both flavors of 4K, UHD, and DCI. Both of these cameras can record raw video, but they do it in different ways. The EOS R3 only can capture raw video internally to CF Express Type B media. You can't do it to the SD card. And on the Sony A1, that raw video can only be captured over HDMI to an external recorder. That raw video from the Canon is a 12-bit RAW profile in a flat 6K by 3164 resolution at up to 60 frames per second. And in 60 frames per second, that write speed goes up to 2600 Mbps. So that is pretty chunky video. A 256 gig card gives me just about 20 minutes of RAW recording time at 24p and 12 minutes of RAW at 60p. Now, the raw video from the A1 is a slightly larger than 4K 4332 by 2248 pixels, also up to 60 frames per second. But this is 16-bit raw video over HDMI, so humongous bit depth there, and as I said, that's over HDMI, which thankfully, you'll be able to do very easily with the A1's full-size HDMI port, which I personally love. But we'll talk about inputs and outputs in just a second. With that being said though, you can pretty much decide for yourself which is the better looking video from these two cameras. I think when it comes to 4K video, well, on paper, they're pretty much exactly aligned. But also, just when I'm looking at the footage in front of me, they are really hard to parse out. I do happen to trend towards liking the 4K video from the Sony a bit better. I think it handles motion a bit more swiftly and smoothly than the R3, but also dealing with color from the R3's C-Log profile was a bit more friendly than dealing with Sony's S-Log in Premiere, but then again, I'm only color grading in Premiere. Okay, next topic on the list is a pretty major one, and that's because it's autofocus. Now, You're pretty much looking at two of the greatest autofocusing cameras out to date right now. Canon and Sony have each made huge breakthroughs in autofocus technology, and being the latest flagship models from each of these manufacturers, that means these are just about as advanced as it gets in terms of autofocus right now. So on paper, the Canon beats out the Sony in terms of phase detection autofocus points. It has 10,053 of these points compared to the A1's 759. But both cameras' autofocus zones do span the entire frame from edge to edge. I know this is like a blanket statement, but I've really done the testing with both of these cameras. Both of these systems, in photo and video, do an exceptional job of finding and keeping focus even in really challenging scenarios with multiple subjects, quick moving subjects, and each offers a lot of fine tuning for the autofocus if it's not really behaving how you would like. Each camera offers subject tracking autofocus via touchscreen on the LCD in photo and video, and also plenty of zone options and adjustment for those zones, so just a lot of customization can be done here on each system. But in my experience using both of these cameras, like I said, they were both really phenomenal, but the Canon's autofocus did happen to act up a little bit less than Sony's. It got just a little less confused than Sony's did at points. And I also just enjoyed navigating Canon's autofocus settings better than Sony's. I love this servo autofocus page on the R3 with these 4 autofocus profiles already broken down for you, and I appreciate how deep that AF tuning goes. But there is also a huge feature that the EOS R3 has that the A1 definitely does not, and it's something that Canon's been sitting on for like decades now. And that's eye control autofocus through the EVF. First off, the EVF on the R3 is humongous and really super quality, but it also does this really neat little trick where if you have this setting on, it can actually track where your eye is looking in the frame, show you where that is, and let you focus to that. So I went into a little bit more depth in my video last week comparing the R3 to the 1DX line, but once you calibrate this to your eye specifically, it works like amazingly well. I wish I could like show you what it does inside the viewfinder here, but I don't really have a way of doing that. But this is an amazing like autofocus workflow that definitely gives the R3 an edge over the A1. Like I would seriously use this. It's not just like a gimmicky autofocus thing. This could like change the game. And also just one last autofocus thing I want to tack on before we move on, but each of these cameras have specific tracking modes for tracking specific subjects like human or animal, and the EOS R3 has a specific mode for vehicle tracking, and kind of like that, the Sony actually has a specific one for bird tracking. Okay, next thing on the list, and we're sort of jumping around a little bit here. I normally talk about build first and then jump into the internal techie stuff, but it's good to switch it up every so often. As I said before, it's pretty plain to see that Sony and Canon went different directions with the build of these flagship mirrorless cameras. And my main reason for saying that is the fact that Sony went with their regular Sony alpha-sized camera body for this A1 flagship. They did not opt for that extended build that we typically see in flagship cameras. That usually houses a larger battery, offers a larger grip area, and offers extra hardware for portrait shooting like you can see the R3 has. So out of the box, the A1 doesn't have that, but the workaround is the addition of this VG C4EM battery grip, which gives you 2 slots for those Sony batteries, and of course, that extends the grip on the A1 and adds those buttons for vertical operation, like I said. But that's kind of a bummer because A, the Sony A1 already retails for like $500 more than the EOS R3, and that grip extension is just going to tack on a couple more $100 to that. And B, I just thought it would have been nice to have a Sony flagship mirrorless camera that was built with that extended body like that, but I guess that's just like personal preference. Given that, the Sony has a bit less room for these buttons and dials, so it is a bit more crowded than the R3, which opted for less physical dials on top, making way for a top display and some really bulky strap rings that are like receded into the body here. Again, out of the box, the R3 just feels way better in the hand and way more like rugged and like ready for an intense all-day shooting scenario than the out-of-the-box A1 without the grip extension. Other build stuff, the R3 has a flip-out articulating screen, which I really like, and this also has the added benefit of protecting that LCD screen if you flip it in for storage. The A1 has the tilting screen seen from many Sonys past, and this is a mere 1.4 million dot LCD compared to the over 4 million dots on the R3's LCD. The A1's viewfinder resolution is greater than the R3's, but I'll take that humongous size of the R3's viewfinder and that eye control autofocus via the viewfinder over that greater resolution any day. As for media, both of these cameras have dual slot options, one for SD and one for CF Express media, and each have plenty of options for card usage by slot. Where they differ is that the R3 takes one CF Express Type B next to its SD slot, and the A1 takes CF Express Type A, but in two hybrid slots that take either SD or CF Express Type A. So I suppose Sony has the media advantage there with two slots for the newer media. Finally, for power, the R3 takes the old battery from the 1DX series, the LPE19, which will power the R3 for roughly 450 shots, which is similar for the A1's NPFZ100 battery, but that's a much smaller battery. And that doubles with the use of the grip extension. So I suppose the A1 wins the power battle there too. And inputs and outputs I'm grouping into a whole nother category we're going to talk about in just a bit, so hang tight for those. For now, let's talk about the sensors and shutters on these camera bodies. Sensor sizes and builds are basically the exact same across these two bodies. Each of these cameras have a 24 by 36 millimeter full frame rear illuminated stacked CMOS sensor. Only difference is the A1 crammed 50 megapixels into that thing, which delivers an 8640 by 5760 still photo in 3x2 mode, compared to the R3's 24 effective megapixels, which offers a flat 6K by 4K pixels at its largest image size. So if image size is what you were going for, the Sony definitely takes the cake there by like a landslide, but this isn't always necessarily a good thing. I mean, of course, it totally depends on what you're using these cameras for. But you've got to consider that both of these cameras have the exact same size sensor, but the Sony has twice as many pixels jammed into that. So you kind of got to deduce that the photo sites on the EOS R3's sensor have got to be much larger, and that is typically a better thing for light gathering, and that's definitely better for low light. Okay, moving on to shutter stuff, and this is another area where these two camera bodies are, again, pretty comparable, but there is some stuff to parse out here between camera to camera. So first off, maximum shutter speed on both of these cameras is a blazing fast 30 frames per second in electronic shutter mode. There's your flagship stat for you right there. And the image buffer is pretty similar for each too. At 30 frames per second, the R3 will take 150 RAWs or 540 JPEGs before the buffer stops, and the Sony will take 155 RAWs, but only 10 more JPEGs than that, 165 in this mode. The R3 also ekes out the A1 in terms of mechanical shutter speed, where this will actuate 12 frames per second mechanically, where the A1 will only do 10 frames per second. And now jumping back to shutter in the terms of like readout, not like shutter curtain. Don't you love digital cameras? The A1 has a maximum flash sync speed of 1/400, where that's going to cap out at 1/250 on the EOS R3. So that's pretty considerable for studio shooters. And just tacking one last video thing here now that we're talking about shutter in terms of readout again, but rolling shutter on both of these cameras is managed really well in their 4K modes, but the rolling shutter is pretty noticeable in Sony's 8K recording mode, which is not that surprising. All right, the last category that we're going to talk about in this flagship camera side-by-side, and this is something that I think really separates a flagship camera from the rest of the pack. But this is networking and connectivity. On the R3, we've got a lot of space dedicated to the 3.5mm microphone and headphone jacks. Under that is the Canon N3 flash sync, and right around the corner is this port for a remote shutter control or intervalometer. Next to that is an RJ45 network port, not a network pork. and above that, in the last door, is the micro HDMI output and a USB-C for connection and data transfer. On the Sony, and first of all, I just like how those doors flip open to a more rigid position, but kind of a small thing. But anyways, the network jack and flash sync are behind this door. There's a slim little door underneath the speaker here for this multi-port USB, which is just there because I think some Sony accessories like specifically use that. And next to that is a door with a USB-C and full-size HDMI. Finally, above that is the headphone and mic jacks, the microphone being the red one. So the Sony gets big points from me just for having that full-sized HDMI, which is kind of funny because the R3 has way more real estate for a full-size HDMI port than the Sony A1, but they decided to give a ton of space to those headphone and microphone jacks, which honestly could be really squeezed together. I would much prefer a full-sized HDMI on this flagship camera. What both of these bodies do have is that RJ45 network connection, or like an Ethernet port, and this unlocks a lot of professional capabilities for each of these cameras. This could help send like hundreds of pictures at a time to an off-site editor that can like cull your photos for you to be turned around really quickly in like a broadcast scenario. That happens all the time. Or this could be used for remotely controlling the camera, like getting it up in the rafters of a stadium for something like that. So that's just one piece of hardware in these things that unlocks a lot of really professional applications. Both cameras offer a 2.4 by 5G Wi-Fi internet connection and also have really good options for connection to a PC and file transferring. And I didn't really have a ton of time to dive into this, but from the menus and stuff, it definitely seems like Sony has more programming built in for connecting the camera to other devices and also remote controlling. Okay, so that's pretty much all I wanted to cover in this side-by-side of these two flagship mirrorless cameras, the Sony A1 and the Canon EOS R3. So let's take a quick recap of the pluses and minuses of each one of these camera bodies. So, the Sony A1, it's got that 8K video capture, slow-mo goes up to 240 frames per second in full HD, and it's also got that full-size HDMI port, which I love. Also, you're going to get a super high bit depth raw video over that HDMI to an external recorder, so all a bunch of really good video pluses right there for the A1. Unfortunately, Sony did stick to that regular Sony alpha size camera body where I know probably a lot of others would have really liked to see like an extended body right out of the box from this thing to just really give you that flagship feel. And it certainly performs like a flagship camera on paper, like don't get me wrong. It's just a real bummer that you would have to spend the extra couple $100s to get that grip extension to really get that flagship experience. And then that's a $7,000 camera body at that point. And as for the EOS R3, since we're on the topic of that extended build, it is just so well crafted and just feels so nice in the hand in both horizontal shooting and vertical shooting modes. And this makes a big difference. If you are using this camera to shoot like a long, grueling day, the feel in your hand is a really big thing. You want to be ready to just take this camera and shoot like any single thing, any place. I don't necessarily feel that way with like my pinky wrapping around the underside of this camera right here. So just kind of an experience thing. But also, it's backed up on the spec sheet too. It's got powerful video tools, exceptional autofocus in photo and video, and they even dusted off some stuff from the old Canon archives, like that eye control autofocus via the EVF. So pretty amazing. A few disappointments though from the R3, like I know a lot of people are mentioning that the battery life isn't really what they hoped for in Canon's newest mirrorless camera. The R3 definitely does suck up power from this LPE19 battery, which could maybe use to spruce up too, because this is the same battery from the 1DX line, which is like getting fairly old by now. Also, the internally recorded RAW is nice, but I think I would prefer if it was recorded externally over an HDMI. And side note, I wish that HDMI was full size. They have the space for it. Also, you may be disappointed in its 24 megapixel sensor compared to the whopping 50 of the A1, but this again is kind of a use case thing. If you're using a flagship camera to deliver like 2,000 plus sports images by the end of the day, and all those images are like pretty locked down composition wise, then 24 megapixels is probably plenty enough for you. But if you want to use that flagship camera to deliver some really high resolution stills for maybe like a fashion or beauty magazine in like a streamlined studio shoot, then you might want all that resolution from the A1. So it really depends what you're getting into. So if you were to ask me to choose between either of these camera bodies, in terms of a flagship camera experience, I am going with the EOS R3, but maybe not exclusively. Like, if I had to take just one body onto a shoot that could take 8K video and also turn around and take near medium format size stills all in the same body, it would surely be the A1. Or would it be the EOS R5? Anyways, you know what I mean. I just had so much more confidence shooting on the EOS R3 than the A1 with handling this camera, interfacing the buttons and dials, fine-tuning the autofocus how I like it. It's just got all those professional tools you'd want under one roof in this camera. So this thing was absolutely made for professional shooters, no doubt about that. So that's pretty much going to wrap up this side-by-side comparison of these flagship cameras, Sony's A1 and Canon's EOS R3. So, as always, if you have questions about either of these cameras or any of the gear you saw in this video, or you have any insights about these flagship cameras, or you have any insights or an opinion about which one of these camera bodies you would bring on to your next big shoot, let me know in the comment section below and we'll start a discussion. Also, if you happen to like this video, hit that thumbs up button down below to let me know you liked it. And if you're not already, subscribe to the channel. And if you are subscribed, you can actually hit that little bell button down there too to be notified whenever we post new content, which is every week. So take care, and we'll see you in the next one.